Good evening, everybody. Hello, Kia ora. My name is David Faulkner. I am the general management or the general manager of property management for Property Brokers in New Zealand. I'm based here at our head office in Palmerston North. At Property Brokers, we want to keep an eye on the future and keep our clients and our future clients up to date with the trends that we anticipate that we will see around the property investment sector and around property management as well, and how it impacts landlords and tenants. And today we've got a special guest who's decided to come on and join us. We work very closely with this gentleman. This is Brandon Van Blerk. Brandon comes from a company called Tether, and I'll get Brandon to explain a lot about what Tether does. It's really forward thinking in terms of looking at how properties perform, but he also developed our Healthy Homes app that we use on our phones, and we go around and our assessors will do the Healthy Homes measurements. So Brandon's done a lot of work with Property Brokers around healthy homes, but he also does a lot of work in terms of measurements of property performance. So Brandon, thanks a lot for joining us on the show. Welcome to this webinar. It's great to have you live and with us at Property Brokers. Where are you coming to us from, mate? Where are you talking to us from?
Talking from Auckland. So thanks for the awesome introduction, David. As you mentioned, I am the founder. We don't know if you mentioned this, but I'm the founder and CEO of Tether. We're a little small, or I guess not so small, 12 employees now, startup outside of Auckland. Been around for the last 4 years, and we're just a team of awesome software and hardware engineers looking at solving building performance problems by monitoring and understanding health, efficiency, and sustainability impacts of buildings using technology.
Okay, and mate, you don't exactly sound like you're from Auckland. Where are you from originally, and how long have you been in New Zealand?
In South Africa. I'm originally from South Africa, so myself and the other part of Auckland, I guess, all from South Africa, and been in New Zealand for the last 12 years, and I'm now a New Zealand citizen, and I've denounced my South African citizenship, so I'm a Kiwi.
So you're supporting the All Blacks and not the South Africans?
Yeah, and it's such a tough topic because I've got two brothers-in-law that are both Kiwis, and this is always a hot topic of discussion: is who are you supporting? So it's I've got an All Blacks jersey and a Springboks jersey. So
one for each camp. Very, very diplomatic answer there. And tell us, how do you get involved in Tether? What inspired you to start Tether?
I'm an entrepreneur and an engineer, and looking for a problem to solve a few years back, and found an issue in what you call the performance gap when it comes to property performance, which is the difference between modeled and actual performance. And when we're talking about building performance, what we mean is health metrics, so how healthy is a home, and that can be measured in a number of ways. Efficiency, how efficient is a home, can also be measured in a number of ways, and how sustainable a home is. And there is this problem where your architect or your developer or your maintenance manager or someone will put in a product or a service and say, well, this is going to improve the health or efficiency or sustainability of your home, but without measuring it, you have no idea whether it's just smoke and mirrors or real or not. And we've created technology that allows you to measure the actual impact that your interventions may have, or your retrofit ideas, or whatever it might be. So we close the performance gap using technology.
Okay. So I mean, obviously it's in the news all the time, and we're actually starting to see now, maybe not so much in property and in property investment yet. I think we will do, and I'm sure that you'll touch on in your presentation some of the trends that you've seen overseas. You've spent time in the UK, but we have as a country committed to this net carbon zero by 2050, and it's starting to impact every industry, and it's certainly going to impact everybody in New Zealand, whether you're a farmer, whether you're a landlord, whether you're a business, whatever it may be. So I'm going to ask you the question, Brandon, are we going to be able to get to net carbon zero? And I'll probably let you get into your presentation. You can explain whether it's possible. And the floor's yours, mate. And and if you've got questions across throughout, you can probably type in your questions. We've got Tony and Shalene, who are from our marketing team. They'll be able to pick up the questions and send them through and be able to ask Brandon as we go. So, Brandon, the floor's yours.
Thank you. Great. Can you see this? Okay.
Yep.
Okay, fantastic. All right. So, how do we get to a net zero carbon rental sector? It's a great question. Before we jump into the answers, though, let's do some definition, shall we? Because some of you may not understand what net zero may mean or what carbon zero may mean. So I want to jump into some of the definitions first and foremost. So what is net zero? So net zero refers to a state in which the greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere are balanced by removal out of the atmosphere. So if you remember algebra, your old maths equations, where you had the little equal sign and you had one on the other side, one on one side and one on the other side, x and y, and you had to balance those out to solve the equation. This is ultimately what we're trying to do with net zero. Is we're trying to look at the carbon in the atmosphere. We want to make sure that we're not putting out more carbon. We're reducing our carbon impact and balancing that equation. That's ultimately what net zero refers to, is that balancing of carbon dioxide releases into the atmosphere. And what are greenhouse gases? If you don't know, greenhouse gases are essentially gases, of which carbon dioxide is what we'll be looking at today. There are some others out there as well that ultimately intercept radiation that's emitted from the Earth's surface. So when the sun comes up in the morning, hopefully, and heats up the land or the houses or all of the ground, it's this blanket that forms in the atmosphere that stops that radiant heat from escaping. So ultimately, you end up putting a thermal blanket over the Earth, and that then stops the heat from escaping the atmosphere, and so you end up with this oven, as it were. So that's what a greenhouse gas is. The more greenhouse gases you have, the thicker the blanket around the planet. This is the mission that we're looking at solving when it comes to the Paris Accord or our climate goals. Carbon dioxide emissions need to fall by 45% from 2010 levels by 2030, reaching net zero by 2050. So this is what we've agreed to as a country, and a number of other countries have also agreed to this wildly audacious goal, and I can get into some of the reasons why, but this is what we're looking at. This is our mission.
And how are we with that, Brandon? Do you know how we're tracking with that particularly?
Terrible.
Terrible.
We're nowhere close.
Yeah.
So that's the unfortunate bit about it, and I guess part of the bad news of this. But it doesn't mean that we're not going to get there, or that the human race will not suffice. We will innovate and hopefully find ways to reduce our impact. In terms of the property sector, which is why we're talking here, what percentage of global greenhouse emissions comes from the property sector, from the building sector, and it's 40%. So 40% of global emissions comes from the property sector, which means that your rental property, accounts for up to 40% of global emissions, obviously as part of a bucket, a very large bucket, but it is a part of a bucket, nevertheless. Cool. And then in terms of the types of carbon, I'm just running through different definitions over here, so we've got a good context to then move into the conversation going forward. There's ultimately two different types of carbon that you look at when you're trying to associate or trying to assess what your global greenhouse emissions are, or what your carbon emissions are. That's embodied carbon and operational carbon. Embodied carbon is all the carbon that is associated to the initial construction phase or the end of life of your rental property. So if you're building a home or if you're renovating a home, the embodied carbon makes up for the transport, it makes up for the materials that you're using. Every aspect that goes into the construction or the retrofit of that building acts as an embodied carbon score or embodied carbon amount.
Right.
And of course, if you're demolishing a property as well, all of that waste also counts towards that embodied carbon. Now, embodied carbon constitutes 11% of the total 40% that buildings contribute in terms of global greenhouse emissions. So it's the smaller of the two, but it is also important, very important, to be able to understand and calculate. Then operational carbon is the carbon that's emitted during the life cycle of that property. So that would be energy costs. It would be anything that's got to do with gas consumption or utility consumption, water, electricity, mainly electricity, heating, cooling, all of that is calculated and put into the operational carbon bucket. And that accounts to 29% of the total 40%. 10.9% of the 29% is residential housing. The others is industrial, commercial, and the like.
Brandon, can I ask a question here, please? I mean, you may not have the information, you may not have the data, but I suspect, and tell me what your opinion on this will be, is that the rental sector compared to the home ownership sector would have a higher carbon footprint due to the age predominantly of the properties. And leading on from that question, does healthy homes have an impact on the reduction of a carbon footprint?
Sure, that's a great question. So the older the home, the less the embodied carbon, obviously, because that's already been accounted for when you've built the house already. So you're not building from ground up. But to your point, the operational carbon would be much higher because the amount of energy that would be required, or gas, if you've still got gas, gas heaters or gas cookers, would account for a much larger percentage of your global emissions than a new home that's running off something that's far more airtight. It's got far more insulation in it, that doesn't require as much heating or cooling, and maybe has more efficient ways of cooking. So an older home will absolutely have a bigger impact in terms of climate change than a newer home would. Healthy homes is supposed to impact climate change as one of the impacts. It's meant to keep houses warm, dry, but we all know that the reality is it's not always the case, right? Just by installing insulation in the floors and ceiling and putting in a heat pump doesn't necessarily mean you're going to stop the heat escaping from the windows or the walls, right? Which is constitutes a large percentage of the surface area of the property. So New Zealand's healthy home standards, I think, is a good start, but I don't think it's doing much in terms of as an impact in terms of where we need to be for reducing your carbon impact. Really what you would need is a deep retrofit, some form of large deep retrofit, which really looks at the total thermal envelope of a building to make a considerable impact.
Okay, interesting.
Cool. So let's look at some of the major impacts that we're going to have, I believe, to the rental sector when it comes to this net zero mission that we have. And I've put it into 3 buckets: legislative changes, banking and how banking will work, and some of the maintenance stuff that you'll have to do on those rental properties going forward. So if we look at legislation as one, now there is some big changes happening from a legislative perspective when it comes to dictating what needs to happen in new builds. So as new builds are done or deep retrofits are happening, where overseas markets, specifically in the UK, and I know that MBIE here in New Zealand are looking at ways that they can legislate around reducing carbon from an operational perspective as well as from an embedded perspective during the construction phase. This legislation, as it starts to come into place, is going to essentially dictate and mandate that a particular property is of a certain standard when it comes to its carbon impact. And what could end up happening is, by not agreeing to this or not complying with these standards as they start to build up over time, the devaluing of your property could be such that they end up as a stranded building. This is something that could potentially happen in the future, where purchasing a low or inefficient building or a building that has a high carbon impact could be such a liability in terms of what it gives from a banking perspective, from an insurance point of view, from a valuation perspective, that it means that the building becomes stranded as cost of retrofit, it may be too much. You now need to try and retrofit that building to be able to get up to standard. You decide not to, so instead of doing, you just leave the building stranded. This is something that has been forecasted in the next sort of 10 to 20 years as legislation starts to ramp up and requirements are needed, and those requirements start to ramp up over time. So this is pretty scary stuff, obviously, for someone who's got a property and doesn't know what this means and what this legislation is going to look like. I don't think it's going to happen overnight. I think it's going to be a thing that's progressive as we start to move into 2030 and to 2050. But a bit like the healthy home standards, if you do nothing up until the day that it ticks over, you could end up in a position where all of a sudden your house is unsellable, it's unmarketable, it's uninsurable, and you've got a real problem on your hands. So,
Brandon, can I just jump in here? So everything that you say, I concur. I do think that we're going to see legislation come into play, but I mean, at the moment, we've got issues with a lack of rental property. I mean, and I mean, sure, many people would have seen the documentary on Sunday with the people in transitional housing and in the motels. I mean, is there a risk here that we just could end up having even more people on a wait list? Yet we've got houses all across New Zealand which just sit there like ghost houses, and no one's allowed to live in them because technically they become non-compliant.
Absolutely. Look, what we're dealing with here is a tug of war, right? It's a tug of war between the sustainability divisions within government and those that are shouting from the rafters, saying, if we don't do something, we're all doomed, right? The price of non-compliance could be mass destruction. This is what we're fighting against in terms of the narrative. And then we have the practicalities of this, which is what you're talking about, which is, well, if we're having to do all these things, and who's paying for it? Who's going to pay for these upgrades? Who's going to pay for the work that's needed to get these buildings up to standard? And if there's not a good answer for that, you may end up in a stalemate of some kind. And look, history will be a good judge of where things land. But the data is clear. Unless something is done, we're in for a shit time, from a climate perspective, which could inflict billions and billions of dollars worth of damage, according to what the climate scientists are saying. And on the other side, you've got another short-term problem, which is we don't have enough rental properties, and we actually, we need to make sure that people are housed. So I'm not sure what the answer is, David. I think it's a really, really tough situation to try and deal with because there's arguments on both sides.
Yeah, I think the banking, the green loans which are available now, Brandon, is probably something which is underutilized by landlords as the cost to retrofit particular houses is probably only going to become more and more expensive when we see issues around supply chains and whatever. So if you've got green loans which are being offered, this could be an opportunity really for our industry to step up to the plate and try and coach our landlords to invest and to get the properties better performing, because I'm sure they're going to be more sellable to tenants as well if the cost of running these properties is so much lower.
Absolutely. Look, from a banking perspective, we're seeing a lot of pressure come down on big organizations, big corporates, right? Banking is a key one, where they're having to, based on legislation, report on their emissions, scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions, which means that they have to report on the direct emissions that they have within their business, the indirect emissions that they're responsible for, and those emissions that they don't necessarily have visibility for, but are inferred through products that they sell. So banking is under a massive amount of pressure in terms of reporting and all of the ESG, environmental, social governance-based reporting is being filtered down from the banks and also from big corporate businesses. So when you have this top-down pressure, what you end up with is innovation happening at that space, which is now where you're seeing banking creating these innovative banking products, these green loans or mortgages. So whether that's a green mortgage, buying a new property, or whether that's a retrofit loan at ridiculous interest rates. I think Westpac has a warm-up loan at the moment, which is up to $40,000 at 0% interest rates for 4 years that you can loan for any upgrade to a property that improves the efficiency or health of that property. So that could be solar panels, heat pumps, insulation, new windows, the works, right? So 0% interest. When have you ever seen a 0% interest?
So I mean, how do you have to prove this? I mean, what do the banks do? Do they go around and check the house to make sure that they've used it, or is it just on good faith?
You just send them a quote, and then they check that you're capable of repaying the loans, which is a typical process that you would do if you were taking any loan out or registering for a credit card or getting a mortgage. And they would make sure that you or your family or your joint income is capable of paying that loan at a 0% interest rate, and then they sign it off. I've got an employee at Tether who's just gotten an $18,000 loan from ANZ to put double glazed windows in his property. So, he's a software engineer, right? So he's not John Rockefeller. So he's managing to get that done, and the banks are doing this because they need to have products in place that help them with their emissions story, right? With their climate story. And I think we're going to start to see far more innovative products coming from lenders and from banks all around targeted retrofits or green mortgages that help the bank with their emissions reporting and also reduce the cost that they have to incur against offsetting their emissions, but also helps property owners and individuals that require money to provide these upgrades so that they can meet their net zero goals, that they have access to this capital over time.
So Brandon, my guess on this is, if you're an entrepreneur, mate, my prediction is that you're soon going to have a double glazing business around New Zealand at some point, because what you're saying, I can see there's going to be a huge demand in the next 5 to 10 years for products such as this.
Yeah. Well, good luck getting past the supply mafia if you want to get into double glazing. But sure, if you can and you can get the windows appraised, I think it's a great idea for sure.
Yeah. Okay.
And then on the maintenance side, which is a smaller one but worth mentioning. So property maintenance, when you're buying products to replace things, right? So whether it's paint or a hole in the wall, or whether it's a new piece of equipment or an appliance or whatever it might be, the stringency around products that are being sold that need to be compliant with net zero targets are being put in place, which means you're not going to be able to buy a product that has a negative impact on the planet or on carbon life cycle. Which means that if you've got other products out there, or you're utilizing products at the moment from a maintenance perspective, they may go end of life, they may become ridiculously expensive. You may have to look at putting in new pieces of maintenance equipment, whatever it may be, that are compliant with net zero targets, or whether it's a heat pump that's efficient, or whether it's getting rid of gas and putting in electrical heating or whatever that might be. So just keep an eye on maintenance as well. And if you are doing upgrades to a property or maintaining a property, the best thing to do is make sure that you're utilizing a product that is carbon neutral, if possible.
Yeah.
So here's some other things to talk about when it comes to changing legislation globally. So we talked about EPCs. I'm not sure if we talked about EPCs. That might have been in the pre-discussion. But EPC standing for Energy Performance Certificates. This is something that has been adopted in the UK and in parts of Europe and other parts around the world as well. An Energy Performance Certificate is essentially like your Energy Star rating for your fridge that you might have seen. It ranks a property from A to G in terms of how efficient that property might be. And this has massive implications because an EPC puts a quality stamp on your property. And if it's a low EPC, you will have a world of problems when it comes to the amount of money that you're paying, potentially an interest rate on your mortgage, and a range of other things that could happen in due course as stringent legislation starts to boil down onto the residential sector, and also look at how EPCs can be utilized to try and get people to move in terms of and comply with what that net zero journey needs to be. There is some talk about New Zealand adopting an EPC as well. I've been involved in some conversations with MBIE and brands, exploring different types of energy performance certificates, what's working, what's not working. There are some weaknesses in the EPC in the UK at the moment, and I know that they're looking at redoing it using real-time data to look at a dynamic energy performance certificate. So if you do a retrofit, for example, an upgrade to your property, then your EPC changes in real time with that upgrade, rather than having to get someone in again to rerun an inspection. You have a home that can do a dynamic EPC, for example. But I think we need to keep our eyes on energy performance certificates, specifically New Zealand. We often copy the UK, albeit years later. I know that there's conversations happening on EPCs at the moment. And if your rental property gets a bad one, it's going to cost a bit of money to get it up to rating. And if you don't decide to get up to rating and you leave it out, the cost implications in terms of resale value and or anything could be quite dire.
I was going to say, Brandon, I mean, I'm listening to you here, and I'm just thinking to myself, this, you know, if you've got a poor rating and you can't rent it out, it's going to have a huge impact, surely, on the value of the property. You know, because whoever buys it, it's probably going to have to invest a substantial amount of money to get it up to a standard which makes it habitable.
Absolutely. I mean, it's like selling a car without a warrant of fitness, right? It's kind of going, you know, it's a bargaining chip for the buyer, and it also just devalues the property completely. So the higher the EPC rating and the more efficient it is, the higher the cost that you can get, right? Or the price that you can get if you're willing to sell the property. But to your point as well, from a rental perspective, the government may come out and say, well, we're not going to rent out a property. You will not be able to rent out a property that's below a certain level of EPC. So we don't want any rental property to be below a C or a D rating, for example, which is a kilowatt per square meter type calculation in terms of efficiency. So this could have a huge impact, much bigger than what the Healthy Home Standards have had in terms of the rental market, but also the resale market as well, selling properties as this EPC starts to be ushered into New Zealand. I think we're still a few years away. New Zealand likes to really take things slowly. I just really hope they do a good job of it, and they don't make the same mistakes that they made with the Healthy Home Standards on that one.
Yeah, because it was rushed. I felt working it in the coalface, it was quite rushed, and then we've had impacts around heating calculators and not taking into account for new builds and brand new properties failing. It was a bit of a nightmare to work through logistically. And I'd concur on that. I'd hope that they don't rush it. And I mean, how does it work in the UK, Brandon? I mean, you've been there, you've been doing a lot of study. And is it possible to have, like the tether device, that what you've got something that is actually tracking data as it happens, and it gives it that automatic grade in real-time information?
Yeah, look, in the UK, there's some weaknesses in the process because it's a bit like the Healthy Home Standards, in that you have an assessor come around with a clipboard, and you'll take down some calculations, and you will infer what the EPC should be based on what the calculations say, right? So quite similar to the Healthy Home Standards in that regard, a little bit more complicated. But as we know, like the Healthy Home Standards, you can do the calculations. You can put a heat pump in, and that complies with the standards, but it doesn't mean it's going to be a healthy home. Right? There's no real data there to show. And this is what's happened in the UK, is there's been enough time now to see the difference between what the rating says it should be and what it actually is. So there are cool ways to be able to calculate EPCs in real time using data, which is something that we have developed and experimenting with. It's something called heat transfer coefficient, which is a calculation of the heat transfer through a building fabric. So you look at the temperature inside a property and the temperature outside the property, and you look at how the heat transfers from inside the property to outside the property over time, your energy usage, as well as your floor area, and you can work out what the actual heat transfer coefficient, or the amount of heat that transfer over time based on the energy you consume. So this is a really good calculation and can be used as a dynamic energy performance certificate. So you can still do the existing checks that you need to do with the clipboard, but just by putting two temperature sensors, one inside and one outside, and doing an energy monitor, you can really dial in what that performance certificate is telling you. So what the actual energy efficiency based on heat transfer. So it's supercharging EPCs, as it were. So this is something that we're looking at doing in the UK in the new year. So keep your eyes out for EPCs. I think this is definitely on the way in New Zealand and could have some massive impacts, especially for banking and loans and mortgages and rental, ability to rent out, and even rents. The amount of rent that you can charge could be compared to the EPC rating as well. Then from a reporting perspective, I mentioned scope 1, 2, and 3 reporting. I don't think that an individual landlord will have to report at this level. This is basically the enterprise level. But I do think going further down the track, companies like property brokers may have to report in terms of on emissions. So any large scale property management organization that has a portfolio of property you may find that you start to have some reporting required in terms of what your emissions are and the properties that you manage and what that looks like. Scary. There's a lot of devil in that detail. It's not like property managers don't have enough to do as it is. But
I was just listening to you there, Brandon, I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, the logistics in dealing with that. I'll have to have all our property managers would be on scooters and get them out of the cars.
Exactly. You can get some property broker scooters and offset your emissions that way. People don't have to drive to the inspections. They can go on e-bikes.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah.
And then the dreaded tax. We know how governments love to tax, and this is something that it looks like is on the tip of politicians' tongues at the moment when it comes to trying to manage the emissions targets, is putting a carbon tax on businesses and potentially individuals that end up contributing a large amount of carbon, right? So this could be through a fuel tax, it could be in terms of your petrol, it could be through energy tax, it could be through an EPC taxing on energy efficient or energy inefficient buildings. I think we should keep our eyes open, and there'll be a lot of people groaning, but as we move towards this 2030, 2050 goal, I think we may see some taxes that are both here to see as well as hidden. So, behind the scenes taxes that we will end up paying, which we may not know that are there, but will being pushed towards emissions offsetting. I talked about some banking products as well, mortgages, loans, and interest rates. And then from a property maintenance perspective, cost and availability, I talked about in terms of those products as well. So what will happen, I guess, from now until that 2050? Well, first of all, millions and millions of buildings need to be intelligently retrofitted to reach net zero targets by 2050. In fact, we need 5% of rentals to be deep retrofitted per year to be able to reach these goals. So when you asked me the question at the beginning, David, are we getting there? Not even close. I think we're at about 1% is kind of is the figures that came out globally, not from New Zealand. We don't have New Zealand specific figures. I don't have New Zealand specific figures, but globally we're at about 1% in terms of current buildings, which will be around 90, I think it is 90 or 95% of current buildings will be around by 2050. So the vast majority of buildings will need to be retrofitted. We're not talking about new buildings here. We're talking about existing buildings.
Yeah.
Then homes that don't comply will risk losing significant value and paying higher insurance premiums. I think that's coming as well. And all new buildings must be built as nearly zero energy buildings and have net zero operational carbon by 2030. So not necessarily New Zealand yet, because we're not there, but I think legislation will move in this way where you will not be able to build a new building eventually because it'll be too expensive unless it's nearly zero energy building. So that's passive, or that would be something where there is a net zero equation associated. So the days of the leaky, drafty type building where it's just cheap as best building to minimum code, I think will be gone by the time we get to 2030.
I mean, this is staggering what you're saying here. And I've heard in a previous interview, a gentleman called Professor Michael Kelly. He's a Kiwi bloke, but he's I think he's in Cambridge University in the UK. And he was saying about 85, you said about 85, 90% of the current housing stock is what's going to make up the housing stock in 2050. We've got about 2 million properties at the moment, Brandon, and about a third of those are used as rental properties. So we're talking, I mean, we're going to need tradespeople, electrical engineers, supply chains. I mean, this is a huge, huge undertaking that this country is going to have to take. I'm listening to you here now, and I'm thinking the smart landlords will be ahead of the curve and use the ability to these cheap loans and no interest loans and start retrofitting the houses now, because I can see, like Healthy Homes, a mad rush on insulation and all types of things and heat pumps, which drives up the cost.
Yep. Look, it's no doubt, it's one of humanity's biggest perceived challenges right now. right, in
Yeah.
terms of what we're facing. So this is unprecedented in terms of where we're at. A bit like the pandemic, where we didn't really know what was coming until it hit us, and now we're still feeling the aftershocks of what COVID had brought us from a pandemic, and that was a light pandemic, right? Like the light pandemic. Like if we had smallpox type level, which wiped out 90% of the world's population, that's a real pandemic. So if the scientists are correct, and we won't know until we get there, unfortunately, we need to be ready for some unprecedented times in terms of climate, whether that's natural disasters, whether that's increases in hurricanes and whatever, rises in sea level, potentially losing hundreds of meters or kilometers worth of coastline and low-lying areas. There's some crazy things to think about if this is true. So it is an unprecedented time, and it's a massive problem. And of course, we're all struggling just to deal with day-to-day issues, not to think existentially about how are we going to save the planet. So it's a real challenge. It's a real challenge.
Jeez, it's a heavy topic. There's a heavy topic. It really is. Yeah.
So let's talk about what can we do, because it all comes down to, I own one rental property or two or three rental properties, and what is it that I can do just to do my little bit to help with this fight and potentially save money and comply with legislation as we go forward. So the first one is retrofit. You don't have to do everything now, but start now. And if anything, you're going to make your rental property better, right? It'll be better for the tenants. It'll be healthier. It'll be warmer. It'll be cost less to run. And take advantage of these loans. Take advantage of the Westpac warm up loan, the ANZ Good Energy loan. ASB's got one as well, and I believe BNZ's coming out with one in a bit. So these banks are coming out with these loans, these ability to do really, really low interest rates, 0%, 1% for multiple years, 3 to 4 years, to be able to improve the way that your property performs. I think it's a no-brainer. If you've got anything but a warm, dry home, you should look at what you could do to really improve things and reduce the energy consumption required, or just the carbon impact of that particular property. Then the reduce is a personal thing, but from a rental property's perspective, you're enabling your renter to reduce their impact by providing a home that has a lower impact. So whether it's reducing for yourself in your own home, or whether it's reducing your tenant's ability to have an impact on the climate by just providing a better environment, that's a good strategy. And then reporting won't need to happen yet, but eventually we'll have to do some form of reporting on exactly what is our emissions, because without understanding exactly what our impact is, how do you know what to reduce? So there's technology coming out. We've got our own technology putting into buildings and being able to calculate what someone's emissions are in real time. There's other technologies out there that do the same thing. And there's Kogo that's coming out that scans your bank account and tells you what your emissions are based on your purchases. There's all of this cool tech that's coming out that makes it really, really easy to understand what your impact is, and then ability to do offsets or make decisions around that. So those are the three suggestions I have in terms of what you as a landlord or even as an individual can do to reduce your impact and get in alignment with this changing world.
Yeah, that's fantastic stuff.
And that's the end of my very depressing, hopefully not too depressing.
Well, I mean, you say that, but it's also it's fascinating, and it's just some of those little things. If we want to run, I don't know, take the ball by the horns and run with it, and we want to try and lead by example. And just some of the tips there. I mean, some of the stuff we can do and give advice to our landlords. And I can just think of services that we can introduce around, project management, partnering with banks and getting those 0% interest loans and being able to retrofit these houses already. I mean, I see opportunity in what you're saying here, and particularly, you've got to be congratulated with developing these devices that actually gives you the ability to track a property's performance, because really it isn't done that well, is it? I mean, it's a major problem, and you've kind of got a bit of a solution there, Brandon. And what do you see the future for your company?
Yeah, look, I mean, we started in the residential sector, as you know, working with Kying Water and other organizations, looking at the link between indoor environmental quality and energy hardship, and how energy actually feeds into health concerns and the like. But we've moved not away, because we are still in the residential sector, but we've moved into other segments as well. So whether that's schools and looking at the efficiency of schools and health, and the link between health and efficiency in schools, and in the commercial sector now as well. And just being able to give facilities managers or property managers or anybody who cares about a building insight into the health and efficiency and sustainability of that building just allows them to make informed decisions, right? Like we've got technology where you can monitor the exact carbon impact that a consumed kilowatt of power has in a 15-minute block, because we know what power station that kilowatt comes from and whether that's a coal-fired power station or a hydro power station. So you can start to, just in an app, you can go, oh, well, this is what my CO2 equivalent, which is what it's measured in, kilograms of CO2 equivalency. This is what my impact is for this month. And you can choose to do what, plant a tree outside or do something to offset that if you care about it. But it's just being informed, David. This is the problem, is we are expected to solve these problems without having foundational information to do it. How can anybody solve a problem without being educated on the foundations of it? Otherwise, it's hearsay. And we have a lot of problems to solve as a society, and personally as well. It can be a bit consuming in all respects. And what we want to do is just make it simpler, make it far simpler.
All right. Well, listen, mate, I mean, first of all, thanks so much for your time and after hours, and pass on my regards to your good wife who's at home looking after your little 10-month-old kid and allowing you to do this. It's much appreciated. Brandon, if anybody wants to get hold of you, or if they've got any questions that they may want to email you afterwards or whatever it may be, what's the best way to get hold of you, mate?
Brandon at Tether, BRANDON at Tether, TETHER.co.nz, or LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, so just look for my name and add me as a connection. Send me a DM. More than happy to chat.
Okay, no, that's fantastic, mate. Thanks a lot, Brandon. It's been great to have you on our webinar, and yeah, we'll catch up again soon in the near future, mate. All right.
Thanks, David. Nice to see you, mate. Ciao.
All right. Bye.